Hello, friends. Greg Koukl here, your host for Stand to Reason. And 1 week from today, well, I want to say is election day, but that's not true anymore. It's election month, right? Because people are, I guess, 40 million people. I think I read this morning have already voted. But in any event, of course, there are lots of things on the line. We're not going to talk about candidates, can't do that. But we can talk about legislation. And California is one of those states, and maybe it's not unique. I know others have initiative processes like California, but basically, it's pure democracy. In other words, there's something, a bill, a piece of legislation that everybody gets to vote on, and the majority wins, and that's pure democracy. And as I've observed this process over the years, I understand why pure democracy is not a good idea and why we have a representative of republic. And part of the reason and it's not because people are stupid. It's just that they're not in a position to be able to evaluate the issues carefully, to see the long-term ramifications or even the short-term collateral ramifications of any piece of legislation. And people who are putting this legislation forward put it in the most appealing rhetorical presentation. And I've marveled over the years during this silly season of elections at commercials that I hear about the various propositions. You see it on TV, you hear it on the radio, and you can watch the entire commercial and not really have any idea of what the proposition is really about, except for it's really bad or it's really fabulous. But you can't make any sense of the proposition proper because of all of the rhetoric that is obscuring what's going on. We want to try to beat that here today because I want to start out talking here about California Prop 3. And I'm kind of modestly ashamed to say that I didn't even know about this proposition until just a couple of weeks ago because my head has been somewhat buried in theological sand and I've been running around doing lots of different things. But this is so important that I've asked Jonathan Keller, president of the California Family Council, to come on board to talk a little bit about it, to bring me up to speed and also you California folks up to speed. But not just California people, because California is kind of like I'm trying to think of the best way to describe it. What happens here happens everywhere else. We kind of lead the pack with sometimes great things and sometimes really ridiculous foolishness. And people think that California is a great state to follow. So that means something like this, if it gets passed, is we're going to see it in other ballots as well. So, Jonathan, this is not the first time we've done things together.
That's correct, Greg. It's great to be back with you. I know it has been a few years, but you are correct. There's a lot going on here in the state of California, and I really appreciate you and STR and your voice. If I can just give you one little long-term plug, one of my first experiences with you and STR was when I was a high school student, and I was doing pro-life outreach up in Sacramento. And I remember in 2003, going and showing your video series. It was either the Relativism Feet Firmly Planted in Midair series or the Pro-Life 101 video series. I did that training in a living room on almost exactly 21 years ago. It was November 1st of 2003. And it was in the living room of Lila Rose and her parents when she was a high school student.
Now, is there like a postscript to that? And Lila Rose is now my beautiful wife, and we have 4 wonderful children, or something like that.
No, not related.
Okay.
Not related, but definitely still good friends. And I remember just getting to see all the work that she's done in the intervening 21 years with live action and everything. It's just been amazing to see how I know those little seeds that you and STR even planted back then have borne a lot of fruit in the pro-life apologetics movement. So,
well, thank you, Jonathan, for that. That is really satisfying to hear. And here you are now, president of the California Family Council, and you never know what small seed you plant or small stone you put into somebody's shoe is going to blossom into something really amazing. And you've been doing great work for years. And I think it was probably 4 years ago or 5 years ago, we were talking about some other political issue that had to do with homosexuality. Anyway, this one is California Prop 3, and I want to cut to the chase because it is at least positioned before the public as a way of repairing what many think was a mistake in another proposition, Prop 8, which made a constitutional amendment to the state constitution of California that normalized male-female marriage. Of course, that's been overturned at 2015 by Obergefell and SCOTUS. And so it seems to me like a non-issue now. It's just hanging there moot and inactive, so to speak. But people want to clean up the Constitution, but it looks like it's going further than that. So can you explain to us what is California Prop 3? What does it say? And we're going to get into some details in a moment as to what it actually means and what it could eventuate in if this passes. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, Greg, to your point, I think it's important just to be very basic and clear here. So let me read for your listeners just very briefly, it's not long, just the current language that would actually be changed. If you read the proposition, it gives just an overview. It's a title and summary. It doesn't actually include the direct language that would be changed in the California Constitution. So that language.
But by the way, just a point of information, how can you pass a law? That's what's going on. People are voting and they're passing a law that doesn't have the precise language of the law itself included in the ballot.
Well, this is in a lot of cases, this is because they stuff in an incredible amount of minutia and legalese into this language. And they essentially just kind of say, well, just trust us. The Attorney General has decided to summarize. They call it the title and summary. This is what the title of the initiative is. This is what the summary of the initiative is. And these are the opponents or proponents. And literally, though, if you want to know more, you can get a kind of a Cliff's Notes version if you open up that official ballot information packet that is mailed out by the state of California. But even that, when we shared California Family Council's concerns, you are limited to a maximum of 500 words in that ballot information packet.
But when you amend the Constitution, you have to amend it with particular words, and it can't be 500 to 1,000 words, right? Amendment. It's got to be a statement, right?
Well, it depends. In some cases, yes, you would assume that's the case. In this case, that's the unique thing. It actually is a very short amendment, all things considered. And the way, though, if you look at the way this is being summarized, and if you look at the way the proponents of this are talking about it, they are only talking about the first section of this proposed amendment. And I will read that. It says the Constitution of the California state of the state is amended as follows. First, that Section 7.5 of Article 1 thereof is repealed. That's the first part. That is the section that was added by Proposition 8 16 years ago. And that section is incredibly simple. It's incredibly direct. The original language of Proposition 8 just simply said, verbatim, only marriage between a man and a woman shall be valid or recognized in the state of California. And that is about as simple and clear and concise as I think you could almost have any constitutional text ever be. So if all that this was doing was a pure cleanup, as they are trying to say, that would be all it would say. It would say Section 7.5 of Article 1 is repealed. Now, Greg, as Christians, as people who believe in God's good design for marriage as being a union between a man and a woman, I would still oppose Proposition 3 on the basis that I think it's wrong to deny the truth about God's design for marriage, God's design for human sexuality. But many of the concerns, the justifiable fears and parade of horribles that you've seen expressed about this, I don't think those would go into effect if it was purely a cleanup measure. But the problem is that Prop 3 does not simply repeal, despite what the proponents say. It adds a second provision, and it says that Section 7.5 is added to Article 1 thereof to read, Section 7.5, subsection A, the right to marry is a fundamental right. And that's the area where we're deeply concerned. It goes on to have a brief subsection, B and subsections 1 and 2, but essentially it says the subsection is in furtherance of both of the following: the inalienable rights to enjoy life and liberty and pursue and obtain safety, happiness, and privacy, guaranteed by Section 1, and the rights to due process and equal protection guaranteed by Section 7. So essentially, they're weaving this new fundamental right to marry into the California state constitution.
Mm-hmm.
The problem, though, Greg, if you notice, it now just says, whereas before the language said the right to marry or marriage between a man and a woman, only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized. It now says the right to marry is a fundamental right. But there is no definition of what marriage actually is under this new fundamental right. And there is no guardrail or boundary really of any kind. And
well, what strikes me, if I could jump in just for a minute, please, Jonathan, what strikes me as unusual about this, and just comparing the two statements, forgetting about, the point proper, it's the wording. One says what, it makes a statement about, I'm trying to think of the best way to put it. It's a statement about marriage and how it is to be understood by the state of California. But the next one, all it does is assert a fundamental right.
right,
Even the Bill of Rights doesn't say freedom of speech is a fundamental right. It simply just says the freedom of speech will not be abridged. It speaks in legalistic language, not in philosophic kind of language, because the legal language is precise. The philosophic language is general. So if you believe in a fundamental right to marriage, okay, well then what would that look like if you fixed that right in specific terms in the Constitution? But they haven't done that. They've just put the philosophical notion in there, which means it's wide open then to interpretation. That's basically what your concern is, right?
Absolutely. And Greg, one thing I appreciate so much about STR is that you guys consistently do a good job of helping Christians understand logical fallacies. And I remember this as I was, in high school, growing up and in college. I remember a lot of discussion about the different types of logical fallacies. And one of them is essentially begging the question, which obviously your listeners are very familiar with. And essentially that is assuming facts in evidence, or it's essentially saying that the discussion or the contention is being assumed. You're just taking it for granted.
Right.
And
instead of arguing for it, right.
And in this case, that's essentially what the framers of this amendment have done themselves. I mean, it is one of the most painful and egregious examples, I think, of begging the question, but now put actually into the Constitution. It is saying the right to marry is a fundamental right. But as you said, it doesn't actually define what to marry means.
Or even what fundamental right means.
Right. Yeah, that's correct. And as a result, we've really been focusing. There's some people, some of our attorney friends that have gone deep in depth about all the different various ways this could potentially be misconstrued. But for us at California Family Council, we've really been focusing, I think, on three key issues that I think are the most likely to occur and the things that I think are most concerning to most of us with a Christian worldview. And those are the fact that there is no definition here on the age of a person who may get married. There's no definition on the genetic relationship between people who can get married. And there's also no definition, I think most crucially, on the number of people who can get married. And again, if you look back at the original language of Proposition 8, it said only marriage between a man and a woman shall be valid or recognized in the state of California.
No ambiguity.
Right. Now, you could argue, well, okay, it's not saying adults, it's not saying consent, but I mean, realistically, that is at least a little bit more clear and concrete. But when you say it is a fundamental right, then what happens is instead of making it an external reality of marriage that two individuals can enter into, it now asserts that every individual person possesses this fundamental right to marry, but it leaves it up to potentially not only courts, but in some cases, even individuals themselves to assert or define what marriage is and how they wish to exercise that fundamental right.
Yeah, by the way, that goes back to that magical language from the Supreme Court in the Casey decision, which says everybody gets to decide their own, you probably know the language, but along the line of you just described, it's very subjectivistic. And what you don't want is you don't want a constitutional amendment to give a right that is translated, interpreted in a very subjectivistic way, because that means anything goes based on the subject. That's the concern. What about the age? What about the genetic relationship? In other words, members of the same family is what you're getting at there, right?
Right. That's right.
And what the number of people, because you've got polyandry, which is like open marriage, and that's been out there forever since 2015. Obergefell, this has been something talked about by people, and why not? If marriage is just whatever, which it seems to me what Obergefell ended up in a practical sense defining marriage, it's a list of names, basically, then why not these different variations? Now, a question I have is the age of marriage is in this state fixed by statute. That isn't true in every state, I don't think.
Well,
But in this state is. Or to go ahead.
actually, Greg, that's a funny thing that you mentioned that, because California, and I'm not quoting some right-wing conservative website, this is the Los Angeles Times. California is actually one of the few states in the nation that does not have a statutorily defined minimum age for marriage.
Oh.
And there have been efforts over the last several years to impose a statutory minimum. Right now, essentially, it says that you can get married with a minor can get married with parental consent and a judge's approval. But again, the ambiguity of this is extremely concerning. There are multiple cases, not necessarily where you have 6 and 7-year-olds getting married, but where you do have people who are clearly minors who are getting married with parental consent, who later on say that they were coerced, they were forced into these marriages for some reason. Oftentimes it's because of some type of religious obligation or religious belief. And in California, despite efforts to actually impose that statutory minimum, ironically, the people who, or the groups who have been the most opposed to this have been groups like Planned Parenthood and the ACLU. And surprise, surprise, it's because when you begin to say that minors cannot consent to certain types of arrangements, it opens the door to asking, well, why can they consent without parental consent to certain types of medical treatments, whether it is surgical abortions or surgical gender transitions. And that's why up till now, both Planned Parenthood and the ACLU have actually been in opposition to this.
Wow. So I realize our time is flying through here. I'm glad you've offered, or you suggested, that some people are kind of going crazy in all kinds of ways this can be applied. And of course, I don't follow the news, but I'm just telling you what I've known in the past. When you look at a piece of legislation like this, then and one wonders, well, wait a minute, this could be used in this extreme way. The authors are saying, no, this will never happen. That's not our intention. And of course, what we've learned is that isn't the way it works out. Once the cat is out, so to speak, this can go anywhere if the language is not precise, because the language is the language of the law. And that's what leads, not the intention of those who, the declared intention. We'll just be charitable. Okay, that's their intention, but that isn't the way it always works. These become tools for much more extreme action. So what is your concern about that?
Well, I would say, in addition to those, the first two things that we mentioned, talking about the age of consent and talking about the genetic relationship, the one that I think is going to be the most likely, I mean, there's some people saying, oh, well, what if you want to marry your pet? What if you want to marry a hologram or your business or something? I mean, those are theoretically, I guess, possible. But the one that I think is almost inevitable if this passes is polyamory, some sort of polygamy. And the reason I say that is because if you go to our website, we've created a special website just for this issue, proposition3.net. It redirects you to the California Family Council website. You can read all of this information. But proposition3.net, there is an article up there, not from a right-wing Fever Swamp blog. This is from National Public Radio, NPR, from May 31st of this year. Greg, this is less than 5 months ago. They report with a highlight article. The headline is, polyamorous families are recognized and protected in Oakland, California. So in April, the Oakland City Council passed local legislation formally recognizing polyamorous families, the first of its kind on the West Coast, and it protects, quote unquote, diverse family structures from discrimination. And if
Hmm.
you go, I won't read the entire article here for the purposes of time, but I strongly encourage you to go and for your listeners to go. It's a 3-minute audio clip from a section of All Things Considered. They're one of their flagship news programs that they did earlier
Right.
this year. And they essentially reference, again, so many of those things. You mentioned former Justice Kennedy's words in the decision of the Casey decision, but look back to what he said also in the Obergefell decision. He talked extensively about that in that decision, that it was the government's role and responsibility to confer dignity on people, and that by refusing to recognize same-sex marriages, the government was incredibly harmful and they were discriminating. They
Hmm.
were even actually almost spiritually or psychically injuring citizens by refusing to recognize their inherent dignity of being a married couple. And essentially, that's what they are talking about in this article. The fact that both in Berkeley and Oakland, they are enshrining into law the idea that it is illegal and wrong to discriminate against people with more than one partner.
Well, this is another thing. Where does somebody get the constitutional, I'm trying to think of the right word here, dictum, that is the government's responsibility to confer dignity, whatever that means? They talk about a living constitution, and that means, in my view, the Constitution is alive with its original intent, and that's what protects us, and that's what people are swearing to defend when they put their hand on the Bible and they swear to defend the Constitution and protect the Constitution. But in this living Constitution, approach, the only thing alive is the imagination of the jurists. And that's where you come up with this: we have an obligation to confer dignity. Where did that come from? Uh, but I'll tell you why I'm suspicious about this, Jonathan. It's because, yeah, I get that. Only a marriage between a man and a woman is valid and recognized in California. Strike it. It does no work anymore in the Constitution because it's a violation, according to the Supreme Court, of the U.S. Constitution, which takes precedence. Okay, got it. Strike it. In other words, this Prop 3 would be fine if it just did this. You said this earlier. But why does it go further? If all they're trying to do is just tidy up the paperwork, why does it go further? This is what troubles me about this. There's a reason why it goes further, especially with a philosophic notion now inserted in the Constitution that has no clear definition. I'm curious. Sometimes, Supreme Court strike down laws because they are ambiguous. Can the U.S. Supreme Court go after this based on ambiguity, or is that's a violation of the state's provision, or what?
Well, it'll be very interesting to see. I think that if California initially tries to go after laws against polygamy, they're going to use this on the state level as, I think, the primary hammer to try to dismantle those laws. The very
Hmm.
interesting thing, Greg, will be to see how the federal government and other state governments respond. And this is where I think the U.S. Supreme Court is ultimately going to have to weigh in at some point, because just as we saw with same-sex marriage, the idea of the full faith and credit clause, different states having to acknowledge the contracts and relationships from one state
Right.
to another, um, that's the area where I think you're going to open Pandora's box, and the U.S. Supreme Court is going to ultimately have to address this. When
Well,
when we've talked about this with our opponents, when I've done discussions with mainstream media outlets, the primary proponent of this is a state senator from Northern California, San Francisco area named Scott Wiener. And whenever he is talking about this, he has said this is just fear-mongering. Polygamy is illegal under state statute. But he's very careful to parse his words there. He does not say,
hmm,
we believe polygamy should be illegal, and he doesn't say polygamy will remain illegal. He just
yes,
says the current status of the law. But everybody knows,
yeah,
Greg, the state constitution necessarily trumps and overrides
of
any
course.
individual statute. And
That's right. So,
it's going to be something that I think activists are very quickly going to talk about this. And Greg, the
okay.
other thing, if pastors are asking, well, look, what's the big deal? How does this actually impact or affect me? Let me read you just one quote from that NPR story a few months ago. Diana Adams, who is one of the people who talked about the lawfare that they are trying to do to pass these laws, said in this report, quote, "It's very exciting that there is a national movement for these laws because once it's made illegal to discriminate against someone anywhere in the U.S., that starts to change the perception of whether that's acceptable."
Yes, and that's true. It does. You change the law, and you change in people's minds the moral equation. The thing that the law is speaking to has happened with abortion. I mean, once abortion became legal, Roe v. Wade, that had a powerful influence on the way people saw the moral quality of abortion. And I realize we're tight on time here, and I'm going to weigh in just with we've heard some really good things from you, Jonathan. I appreciate the time that you spent, but um, the way I'm thinking about summing it up is um, this Prop 3 doesn't just clean up paperwork. If that's all it were doing, all it would have to do is strike one line, which is irrelevant anyway, because the Supreme Court has spoken on that issue. It adds something that I am convinced is nefarious, and you've given some of the reasons why. It is the language is vague enough to create all kinds of difficulties. And it's not hard to see the way that this could be used to advance a leftist agenda that has been moving aggressively for a long time on these very issues. And it isn't just letting people do whatever they want to do. This is a constitutional amendment for the state of California saying the people of the state of California are affirming and asserting this as a fundamental right, and who knows what the courts are going to decide are the proper ramifications. Because by the way, at the state level, it's going to be the state Supreme Court that adjudicates that.
That's
and
right.
I have no confidence. You're nodding vigorously there. I can see in the camera because
Yep.
I have no confidence that they're going to they have any reason to be conservative on this.
Well, if anybody really believes that the California Supreme Court is going to take a bold and principled moral stance against polygamy, I would love some of whatever they are drinking or smoking. But it's it's just kind of remarkable to think. Greg, I'll just close if I could with one thing.
Sure.
If you look back, this is something that is not new to our fights here in the United States. If you look at the original platform of the Republican Party from 1856, when the Republican Party was originally founded, a lot of people think that we were just an anti-slavery party. And I should say we, I don't mean you and me specifically, I mean the Republican Party more broadly. The Republican Party was founded in opposition to slavery, but in that first initial platform, they actually said we are coming together to oppose what they called the twin relics of barbarism. And they literally said polygamy and slavery were the twin relics of barbarism. Polygamy is not good for children. It's not good for women. It's not good for society. And it's remarkable to think how we have now come full circle, 170 years later.
Yeah, well, people are going to say, well, it's in the Bible. And my response is, yeah, and it didn't work out very well then, did it? It certainly wasn't God's plan. Talking with Jonathan Keller, president of the California Family Council. Jonathan, thanks once again for joining me and for giving your wisdom on this really important proposition, California Prop 3. Greg Koukl speaking here. Say no. Just say no. This is dangerous stuff. So thank you, Jonathan, and all the best to you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Greg.
All right, let's take a break, and I'll come back with more here on Stand to Reason. So I ended the last segment with a strong exhortation of sorts, no on Prop 3. Well, you can only vote no on Prop 3 if you, in California, of course, if you vote. My understanding is there are tens of millions of people who identify as Christians who don't plan on voting. Actually, you're election cycle to election cycle don't vote. And this really mystifies me. And I want to speak to that for a few minutes. There's a question that can be properly raised, at least raised, about all kinds of obscene things that were happening in the first century, like slavery, for example, where Christians, in principle, could have spoken out against and did not. Why? Well, I'll tell you why they didn't speak out against it in the first century, why it was never challenged by first century Christians, because they had no power to do anything about it. From a policy perspective, they had no suffrage, they had no voice, they had no vote. But that's not true of us. We have suffrage. We can vote. And I want you to think about a proverb, and I've thought about this one a lot. And I haven't given much thought to the proverb, except for the point of the proverb, which has occurred to me many times, and you don't have to think about it much because it's really clear. It's Proverb chapter 3 and verse 27. And it says this: do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to do it. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it's in your power to do it. Now, you might strain at this: those to whom it is due. Who do I owe good to? Well, according to Jesus, your neighbor. And according to the way he characterized your neighbor, that means like even your worst enemy. That was where the Good Samaritan parable came in. And if you recall the Good Samaritan parable, there was a Jewish man who was injured or wounded by robbers, whatever, and left by the side of the road, and he was in bad shape. And a whole bunch of people walked by, people that were, in a sense, ethnically close to the injured man, and they crossed over to the other side of the road and they walked around him. They did not do good. And it wasn't until the Samaritan, who was one of the chief foes of Jews at that time, bitter enemies in many cases, it wasn't until the Samaritan, seeing this human being, though a Jew, in trouble, gave aid to that man, did not walk around on the other side and pass him by, but helped him and brought him to an inn and then paid for his care after the Samaritan continued on his journey. He was the Good Samaritan. And Jesus was saying, that's your neighbor. Now, there was a reason he gave the parable, and the reason was to show that we are not going to be justified by our own works. Because he gave the parable after the legalist who actually shared both of the great commandments, love your God with your whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Then when Jesus said, good, you got it. That's what you must do to inherit eternal life. Then he said, wait a minute, who's my neighbor? And then Jesus gives the parable. So the parable is meant principally to demonstrate our complete ability to satisfy God's requirement. We're not going to love our neighbor or God the way we are obliged to do in God's economy. But we don't want to miss there is the moral story there too. You have somebody in need that was bypassed by the people who were not good. And it was the good one, even though an enemy, that was the willing to give aid when he could. Back to Proverbs 3:27. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it's in your power to do it. We have suffrage. We can vote. We can make a difference in the lives of our neighbors, our national neighbors, our local neighbors. We can vote according to our conscience and according to the way the Bible instructs us is appropriate in light of God's purposes for government, which is principally for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do good. So the government is supposed to protect us by punishing bad people who do bad things. And it's supposed to protect us by encouraging people who do good things. Both of those things are things that will result in our community flourishing. And therefore, when we abet those enterprises, then we are doing good to our neighbor. And what's one obvious way where we are walking on the other side of the road and not doing the good to our neighbor that we can do that is not burdensome? We can vote. We can vote for those either candidates or initiatives in the states that have initiative process. We were just talking about that, California, that our best judgment tells us will promote human flourishing, will encourage the good and discourage the bad, to put that principle, God's principle for government, in a little bit more general terms. Okay. Now, I want you to think about some other proverbs, and actually a bunch of these are towards the end. I was reading, I'm almost done with the book of Proverbs, and I read, half a chapter kind of before I go to bed. And I say kind of because I don't do it every single night, but it's just a way of ending on a right note before I turn to something else I'm reading. I just want to keep being fed. All right. Proverbs 28:12, when the righteous triumph, there is great glory, but when the wicked rise, men hide themselves. 28:28, when the wicked rise, men hide themselves, same concept. But when they perish, the righteous increase. 29:2, when the righteous increase, the people rejoice. But when a wicked man rules, people groan. 24:24, he who says to the wicked, you are righteous, people will curse him. Nations will abhor him. Chapter 20, verse 26, a wise king winnows the wicked and drives the threshing wheel over them. Chapter 20, verse 28, loyalty and truth preserve the king, and he upholds his throne by righteousness. And then 18:5, to show partiality to the wicked is not good, nor to thrust aside the righteous in judgment. You can look at all of these. They all say the same thing. When there is righteousness encouraged in a country and reflected in the leadership, that's good for everybody. And when there is unrighteousness encouraged by the leadership or reflected in the country, then that's not good for anybody. It might be good somewhat for the leaders who can cash out on it. But this is, if we are going to be loving our neighbor, if we're going to be caring for others in that second great commandment, we want to see to their well-being. And we have an obligation to do that. And one simple way to do that is to vote. Now, when I suggest that, other things come to mind. And two things that are kind of related and especially important during the election season. And the first one is the question of whether God takes sides. And the second is on the issue of partisanship, arguing for and defending your own side against others. Oh, that's a partisan thing. We shouldn't be so partisan, some people suggest. And here are my two basic convictions regarding these things, because they're very important during this time as you try to work out not whether you'll vote. I hope I just answered that question biblically, but on how to vote. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I want to suggest some thoughts about how to vote. Actually, they were implicit or explicit in the comments that I've talked about. And incidentally, when I talk about the problem of evil, one of the points that I make is, what is God doing about the problem of evil? And I say God's given institutions to mitigate the impact of evil. Okay, one of those institutions is government. The other one is the two others are the church and also the family. And when all the government, church, and family are doing things the way God wants them to do it, well, there's less evil in the world. And when it comes to government, it's the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those to do right in kind of simple, summarized form. There's more you could go into that the scripture says, but that's the core of it. Okay, so if you want less evil in the world, then you want to encourage government to do its proper job. How do we do that? By voting. So here are my two basic convictions. First, God does take sides. Second, partisanship is not only good, it is morally required precisely because God takes sides. Now, I saw a bumper sticker once that said, God is not a Republican, he's not a Democrat either. Okay, now, frankly, I think these bumper stickers are either disingenuous or a well-meaning but ultimately silly slogan. All right. Here's why. All politics, that is, politics as an enterprise of civilization, politics as such, all politics is moral. The whole political process is about, I mean, in principle, in its best sense, it's about governing people using power for the common good. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen, but in general, that's what at least we say we're trying to do. This is a good law, not a bad law. What do we mean? It's morally good, not morally bad. All right. And politics, then, in that sense, is the proper use of force to accomplish moral ends. I know people say, well, you can't legislate morality. All legislation is moral. If not, it's illicit. In other words, if your use of government power is not for the common good, well, then you're not using power properly. And by the way, we know this, and this is why we complain about things that we see happening in the public or political sphere, because we say, look, that person is not using his power in the right way. He's doing it for personal gain or for parochial concerns, wildly partisan concerns, helping the small group that's on his side and not being concerned about the larger group. Okay. So just understand as a foundational thing that the political process is a moral process of necessity if it's operating even marginally the way it ought to, as opposed to despotism where you use power for personal gains. And that's an immoral use of power. I think most acknowledge that. So all law rests upon the necessary foundation of morality. Okay, that's the nature of law. Okay, properly exercised. So the American political enterprise is a moral one. And since politics is a moral enterprise, that is the proper use of power to accomplish moral ends, the common good, then it follows that there are right and wrong answers to political questions, that there are moral and immoral policies. And if so, and if God is concerned about right and wrong, which he is, and if God is always on the side of the right, which he is, then on any given political or moral issue, God has a point of view on this. He takes a side. Now, I'm not saying right now which side that is. That's a matter for reflection and deliberation, but how can you avoid that? If politics is by nature moral and God is a moral God, then he cares about any particular moral issue that's a policy concern. Is that a good one or is that a bad one? God takes sides. Okay? Then God has a point of view, and if you share that same view, then you are on God's side, and he is on your side. Now, it's probably safe to say that any particular party's platform contains policies that are both good and bad in some mixture. I mean, no party gets everything right. But since this is not a pure democracy, thankfully, we don't get to pick and choose by voting on particular issues, except for in the goofy, what do they call it, the initiative process, like in California and other states. All right. So we don't get to pick and choose. Instead, we vote for a candidate who represents an amalgam of positions. Some we may agree with or may disagree with. And if we disagree with them, we think they're wrong. And if they're wrong, then there are things that God would not support either in isolation because they're wrong. But since we only get to vote for a candidate and not for the issue directly or issues in a political race, there are only a handful of candidates, or especially in the most races, there are only two candidates. We have a two-party system. Then one candidate or the other will represent, on balance, when all the proper weighing of variables like means and ends and moral significance, etc., are taken into consideration, one candidate of the two will represent the morally superior position from God's perspective, Now, again, I'm not saying who that is going to be in any given election. That's not my purpose. What I'm saying is you can't avoid that kind of calculus. If all legislation properly exercised is moral, that's the nature of it, then God has a view because God is a moral God, either good or bad on any particular view. And when you're voting for one or the other, and there's no other choice, and they represent a complex amalgam of views, in principle at least, it could be that the positions taken as a whole, one is more moral than the other. And if one is more moral than the other, and Jesus had to vote, that's the way Jesus would vote, the one that is moral. Like I said, if Jesus had to vote. I guess you could have a circumstance where you say, I'm not going to, both are equally bad, and I'm not voting for either one. Okay. But generally, that's not the case with a moral assessment of any parties or candidates' views. And we have a standard for that moral assessment. We're not shooting from the hip. We're Christians. We have a biblical worldview. And then whatever party it is that we are going to vote for or individual, we should be able to say, I genuinely believe that God would vote with me on this one. And if we can't say that regarding our exercise of the right we have to make a difference through our vote, then we should change our vote. No, I think God's mad at this whole thing, but I like it. All right, well, if you're not a Christian, you could do that. And by the way, this isn't arrogance. It's careful, responsible thinking about the nature of politics, about the nature of morality, and about God. And that brings me to the issue of partisanship. And there is an appeal by many who say, let's get beyond party differences and focus on running the government. You see this kind of thing, whether it's genuine or disingenuous, that's another question, but you do see this comment. I think that's misinformed. Let's get past our differences and get things done. Well, you can only get things done a certain way. You have to have certain opinions about the things that you're getting done and the best solutions for them. Okay. Now there are two ways you can be partisan. One is a vice, but I think the other is morally obligatory. Now, the vice is let's get beyond our squabbling about what's wrong with this machine and let's just fix it. Now, of course, if you're going to fix something, you have to know specifically what is wrong with it. And before you can know that, you have to know how it's supposed to work properly. And that is precisely the differences between candidates and parties. Solutions depend on a diagnosis and a proper understanding of what the symptoms are and what disease lurks behind them. All right. And we may end up on the wrong side of a political decision and therefore on the wrong side of God on that issue because we get our facts wrong or we haven't looked hard enough or close enough, or maybe someone has to give us the facts and they're not giving us the right facts, the media, for example, or whatever, rhetoric, etc. But nevertheless, it's our obligation to vote, as I've argued. And if we vote, we're going to have to vote for one candidate or another. And the question we should ask is, which one do we think, given their policies, given what they said they represent and what they're going to do, it's our job to vote for the one that in our assessment is going to be the one that will do the most good for the most people. Now, the word good isn't just hanging out there in relativism land. We know what the good is because we're Christians. We're followers of Jesus. We see what he said and the way he lived his life and also what he believed in about the worldview and the foundation for morality that he promoted. There are right choices and there are wrong choices. Or in some cases, there are good choices and better choices, or bad choices and worse choices. But nevertheless, one is going to be better than others when assessed according to a moral standard. Um, and I'm talking here about policy concerns, and policies are advanced and determined by legislators who we get to vote for. All right. So, should we be partisan? Yes. We should be committed to the side that we are convinced will do the most good from God's perspective based on what God says about the proper function of government. Then that requires that we have to look more closely. We have to think about these things. We have to be morally educated about what the good is. We have to be biblically conversant in the things that God wants for the exercise of government. I mentioned the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. Well, this is a very, very broad notion. In other words, it's very simple in its expression, but it has lots of applications. It has a local application in your local community. You know, how do we decrease badness? What kind of policies would discourage badness or punish badness? I mean, some things are directly, statutory, and they say, don't do that or else we're going to punish you. That's one way. Another way is to discourage bad behavior, even though you're not strictly speaking punishing it in a statutory way, like putting them in prison or something, or fining. Well, so those are ways we can discourage badness. And how do we encourage goodness in our local community? The local government this is what they should be spending their time doing, making the community safer, protecting its citizens, and also protecting it from harm without, and also protecting basic fundamental rights within. That's the punishment of evildoers and those who praise of those who do good. This is all involved there. And the Constitution has something to say of what those fundamental rights are. Those are the good things. You can read them yourself and you think if they're consistent with scriptural truth, but in my sense of the basic, liberties that we have, the Bill of Rights are. And so government should be protecting those kinds of things for the good of the people. But it's not just local communities. There are also statewide. There's national laws pertaining to protecting within, but also from without. So the threat to people of goodwill is not just kind of internal, but it can be external too. Nations get attacked. December 7th, 41, we got attacked. Pearl Harbor destroyed. Okay, the government responded. Now, that's a much more escalated active response, but it still is within the basic purview of punishing those who do bad. You're not going to get away with that. We're going to go after you, and we're going to punish you for this so you don't do it again, and you don't do it to other people. We're going to protect ourselves. So this notion has lots of different applications, all right, in terms of government. And also, we're supposed to obey the government, but there are different levels of government. There are the statutes. There are what presidents decree under certain circumstances, but all of these things are beholden to other laws. So we're under state laws, right? But one of the basic laws that we're under is the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. That is a law. What happens when one law conflicts with another law? You can make a legitimate case in saying, I'm not going to obey this law because I am going to obey a higher authority, a higher governmental authority that trumps this law, so to speak. Okay, and these are not easy things to decide. Sometimes they're tremendously difficult to winnow, to figure out what is good and what is true and what is sound, and to balance one thing against the other and try to look at, well, what are the longer term effects of this particular policy issue that we want to have good for people here, but it might produce bad for a whole lot more people down the line. That's kind of what we were talking about with the California Prop 3 innocuously, oh, a right to marry. It's a fundamental right. I think it's dangerous language, but you could be in favor of marriage and saying, yes, people ought to be allowed to get married, but without realizing the long-term impact of the language here having something very, very bad happen to society. All of this is involved in biblical suffrage, which you have a right to do, to make a difference in your culture and to love your neighbor. 1 week you have to fulfill that obligation. It's not hard. Please do not shirk that responsibility. Greg Koukl for Stand to Reason. Give them heaven, friends. Bye-bye now.